Hello and welcome back to Coast FC, the Canadian soccer podcast focused on all things CBL, Canadian Championship, and more. My name is Felipe and we have no Mike Rice today. He was unable to attend for this recording session, but we have replaced him with another very special guest, a favorite from the show from last season. We haven't been able to get him on much this season, but he was a frequent guest in 2023. Welcome to the show, Alex. How you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Great to be on, Felipe. It's too bad Mike couldn't be here. It's always great to join you too, but I'm sure between us two, we should be fine. I mean, it's funny, we're actually sitting down and talking CPL because I feel like, of course, for those unfamiliar, we always get to sit beside each other at Vancouver FC games and chat CPL anyways. So I'm sure this will just be like a Friday night lights at out in Langley for us.
Yeah, though probably a little bit less colorful language as we tend to have on those games there. I'm sure it'll be a little bit of more of a professional discussion here. But yes, it'll be, especially since we have so much to talk about. There's a lot of things, a lot of contentious points to discuss in this past weekend's games. Obviously, match day 22 of the CPL, only 6 more, I believe, match days to go. A couple teams have 7 more games because of the weird scheduling thing. But yeah, the end of the season is coming quick. And so there's a lot to cover as the drama builds and intensifies. But before we dive into everything that happened this past weekend, remember to follow us on all of our socials at Coast to Coast FC, as well as finding us on YouTube so you can see the visual side of the podcast. But let's start with the game that we were actually at. Alex, the first game of the match day, you mentioned Friday Night Lights. That's what it was at Willoughby. Vancouver FC against York United. And it was a game where I think there was some expectations going into it that it was going to be a big game. Vancouver, coming off of the loss against Ottawa, York United trying to find some form again. We were expecting a really, I guess, like a high intensity match. And I guess we got it a little bit. But it kind of took a little bit of a turn for Vancouver FC quite early because they conceded early yet again from another set piece. It's literally copy-paste from the game against Ottawa, and it pretty much played out in the exact same way. And it was funny because we were both at the post-match, and Afshin mentioned that they worked on it every day, the set-piece defending, every day the week before, but it didn't look like it at all when we were watching it from the game. What did you make of Vancouver's early start and the issues that they're having right now with the set piece defending?
Yeah, it was a bit of a strange one because I had the chance to cover both the Vancouver Ottawa game and then this one, and I was just like, man, pretty much just write up the same report. Okay, let's try to find a new way of analyzing this. But yeah, it's really tough for Vancouver because they can be such a good team when they allow the game to open up, to come to them when they hit you in transition. But to do that, you need to start strong, right? You need to take control of the game. You can't let the opponent grab a lead because I think teams are starting to realize Ottawa did it to perfection. Score early against Vancouver, sit back, dare them to break you down. Vancouver weren't. 5 shots against Ottawa. Now against York, same thing. York scored early. They sat back, and it was impressive because York was missing Frank Stirring. Noah Batney only lasted, 15 minutes before he had to come off injured. York was shorthanded defensively. Still, they were able to just sit back, limit space, and they knew that, okay, they did that. They were going to keep Vancouver at bay. Vancouver gets just 7 shots in a game where they trailed for, 86 minutes plus the stoppages. For Vancouver, it's a huge worry of, the slow starts because they've had a lot of games where they've had to chase. And to their credit, I think they've done well. I know Afshin Gapi will point out that they've got one of the best records when trailing in the league. But I think teams are starting to realize that if you score and you sit back, that's kind of where you find that Achilles heel for Vancouver. And it's a huge worry because, of course, they're in a battle just to make the playoffs. But if they make it there, everyone can defend right now in that top 4. York can defend, Cavalry can defend, Ottawa can defend, Forge can defend. There's not going to be, they're not going to open up the game in the playoffs. They're going to want to keep it caged. And I think there is some concern there for Vancouver that they can't chase the game. And of course, set pieces are a huge worry because it was just too easy for York. It's one thing if it was a well-worked routine. Ultimately, it was one short pass, ball right on top of the 6 header. Like, it wasn't anything complicated. The week before was a near post Olympico that had got me quite incensed. It's a bit of a worry how simple it is becoming too on those set pieces.
I think that's the biggest concern is how easy it is. And it kind of, for me, looking at it, points not so much to maybe technical issues in terms of, the organization of set piece defending. I think it's more of a mentality issue of the just players aren't switched on. And I think teams know that and teams understand that if you start the first 5 minutes on the front foot and you bring it to Vancouver FC, they will make mistakes. They won't set up properly, and they'll concede early. And that's a really big issue for Ashingapi right now is the fact that they are just soft when they start. And sometimes you can see good things like glimpses of what they can do, but overall it seems like they need to be hardened a little bit from the beginning, especially of set pieces. And yeah, you mentioned the whole idea of York and Ottawa had basically the same game plan, and I really think that they've shown the rest of the league, hey, by the way, here's how you beat Vancouver FC. You just start strong, force them into mistake, score, sit back, defend, and then because they're not a team that likes to have sort of the onus on them of building and patient possession play, they're a team that likes to play in transition. They're a team that likes to attack quickly. They're gonna make mistakes, and then you get the opportunity to go and attack quickly, and you get the opportunity to go and score. Which, arguably, last week against Ottawa should have scored. It should have been more than just one. It should have been two, three, maybe even four. But they were a little bit wasteful there, just like this week. But we'll talk about that later. But it feels like Vancouver FC are struggling to find a plan B right now. And it's becoming more and more of a concern. And I don't know, when you see the way that Vancouver FC play, Alex, do you see them able to kind of have a plan B? Or do you think that this is about the limit of what they can do as a collective? They're just being built to be this transition team, and now that they've sort of found their own kind of worst enemy in terms of the score early low block, they can't really muster up a response.
Yeah, I think the plan B is a very good point, because I think it's telling that I guess the fact that earlier in the year they'd been getting those results when trailing, because they were just kind of like, all right, we'll just keep doing our game and it'll pay off for them. And I think as teams have seen them and said, all right, this is what Vancouver does, let's try to limit that. Vancouver hasn't had any answers. And it's a surprise to see them struggle against low blocks, because I think they have, in my opinion, two of the best weapons against low blocks. And I think those weapons are, and even I guess they have a third now. The two that I was referencing are Gabby Batar and Alejandro Diaz, because Batar's traditional between the lines, can be so dangerous, can play on the turn. He can shoot from distance. Forge learned that the hard way earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's huge against low blocks, to have that threat of just, all right, sit deep, I'll just punish you with the shot. And then, of course, there's Diaz, who's one of the best poachers in the league in terms of one-touch finishes off crosses. Yet Vancouver as well, it's like, even they've struggled out wide to get the sort of delivery. And now, of course, they've got Eamon Salouf, who can break down defenses, can be a 1v1 player. Those are three solutions, I think, that are there. But for whatever reason, when it comes to actually trying to break down the low blocks, it kind of just feels like everyone kind of loses themselves. Like, you just kind of didn't see Diaz as much as you should have across these two games. You didn't see Batar between the lines. Of course, he wasn't in this York game because he was out on international duty, but Salouf, you expected this would have been a game where you see a lot of Salouf, and they struggled to get him the ball as much as possible. So yeah, I think it does come down to plan, because I think they have the solutions there. They have the pieces to look at low blocks. But like they're even Vasco Fry, right? Like, he's someone who can shoot from distance, who can break down low blocks. They got two. They can often employ attacking fullbacks. Like, for me, they have all the solutions there, but yeah, for whatever reason, it's a matter of execution, and I think perhaps that comes down to planning in that regard, at least offensively. Because defensively, it sounds like they have a plan, they're just not following it. But offensively, it's you watch. And I think for me, the tell is always when guys are flat-footed, looking at each other, not making the runs off the ball. It kind of is like, all right, you clearly want that instruction that might not be there to that extent when it comes to looking for that plan C or D.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is a good point of it's something about the execution. And I don't know. Obviously, we're both live pretty far away from Langley. We'd make the trek for the games, but we're not there for the training, so we don't get to see what goes on in the training games, or like the training sessions and the little mini matches. But you have to imagine that they would be a team that practices, different kinds of attacks, whether it's out wide or through central channels and transition. But it feels like they become a little bit one note in games, at least lately, and it makes me wonder what is the kind of disconnect between what I assume they're doing in training and then what happens in the games, because like many people have mentioned, coaches, players, pundits in the league like the CPL, where you face each team, 4 on 4 occasions, you gotta switch things up. You can't just play in the same way. And I think Vancouver FC are kind of struggling with that in this last quarter, where in the first quarter they surprised everyone in the way that they played, but now after playing them for 2 3 times, Vancouver FC, and you have to switch things up a little bit. And you mentioned Amon Salouf. I think he is the key to that issue for them. He's a player like few in the league that can unlock a low block by just taking a man on, taking 2 men on, creating space, occupying space. But I struggled to see him. I think he was man marked, honestly, in the game as well. I think York had 1 or 2 players always with him in the central areas to make sure that he was always uncomfortable on the ball, which I think was smart from Benjamin Mora. But yeah, with Vancouver, it's just a matter of, can they deal with the mentality issues of not conceding early off set pieces, and B, can they find a plan B for when they have to defend, or when they have to attack a low block, and when they don't get the luxury of heading in transition. I think that's going to be the biggest thing that Afshin Gopi needs to work on. But looking towards York, because talk a lot about Vancouver, but York was the winner of this match, and they did a lot of great things. Biggest thing, and I think you mentioned this in your analysis as well, is the fact that they were so defensively sound, even with a thrown together back line. I mean, we saw Niall Higgins come in for Frank Stirring, and we saw, like you mentioned, Noah Badnick got taken off, I think, 15, 16 minutes in, and Elijah Adekugbe had to be thrown in. And that's a makeshift back line if I've ever seen one, but they managed to get the job done. What did you make of their defensive performance?
For me, it's the kind of win that if York make the top two, if York win the title, regular season title, these are the kind of wins you need, where I think, what I've come to learn of watching these title contenders over the years is, of course, title contenders are going to rely on their big guns. Like, for York this year, a lot of it's been Brian Wright doing magical things. It's Mobabuli being Mobabuli. It's, some of your Stirrings being a rock at the back, Abatne stepping up, Vincencini being one of the finds of the season, Adekugbe quietly has been incredible under Mora. The way he's just been unlocked in every phase of the game, final third, middle third, now defensive third. But in a game like this, where you're missing some guys, it's gutsy. And I think it's telling that Niall Higgins, someone, I think it almost blew my mind when I was looking, like he played like a combined 10 minutes or something in the last 4 months before this recent stretch where he's had to start in the place of Stirring. Like, that's tough for a guy, especially new coach came in and he was on the outs. Like, he basically had played that's it. I think it was 2 minutes under Mora, because all of his minutes had come under Martin Nash. So clearly he was on the outs. Yet from what Mora said and from what his teammates have said, just kept his head down. He kept working, kept doing his thing, got called upon, put in 2 sparkling performances, and this one against Vancouver was excellent. He scores a goal, but his work defensively, and Adekugbe, he's been great in midfield. It's tough to we have no one at center back, go in there, does the job. And I think that's what's telling right now with York, is that of course their big guns are doing the job, but they can look across the line. It feels like, depending on the day, if someone has to step up, they'll do it. And I think that's the sign of a championship winning team. And we'll see. It's something it's funny. Higgins might not start in the playoffs just because of their depth, but a win like this could be so crucial to what they want to do in that postseason.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point about championship sides. When you see them, not just in the CPL, but anywhere across any of the leagues, the top leagues in Europe and in North America, South America, you see that the championship winning teams have everyone pulling in the same direction, and have everyone, even if they only play a few games, when they get those opportunities, they play really, really good matches so that everyone does their part. And I think that's something that for York United, with their defense in this particular match, they really showcase, is that even when a player like Elijah Kugby, who I think he told us in the press conference never played center back before this season, gets put there and puts in, arguably maybe a man of the match performance. And you see how much, he talked about clean sheet, how he was happier about the clean sheet than the result itself. It's that kind of mentality, it's that kind of performance that really, puts that kind of wind in their sails of, yeah, this is a team that's capable of achieving great things. And it puts them back sort of into that title race, or at least at that top two race, especially, Ottawa dropped points. We'll talk about them, and Forge won still, so they're still 6 points behind Forge. But with 6 games left, anything could happen in those games as well. And York United, had they lost this one or had they dropped points, could have been well out of the race at this point. But that win really put them back into this fight. And do you see them capable of being able to push Ottawa and maybe even Forge all the way until the final day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I would say about York right now, what I'm keeping an eye on, is I still like. I think it's been positive to see depth guys step up, but I do worry about their depth, just because in the sense that, especially Forge, Cavalry, and Ottawa, they're all super deep, and that like they can withstand it. Whereas for York, we've kind of seen like Wright dropped. Like that's a tough one given how good he's been. Stirring, because their center back depth has been light this season. You've noted, like we've seen that. That's why Adekugbe's had to play there. So I worry a bit about their depth, but I think if they can keep getting these kind of surprise performances, they'll be all right. And what I'll continue to say is, for York, I think they're a team that as long as they make that top four, they're going to be a threat because they feel kind of built for the playoffs. Like feels like playoffs, they'll get guys healthy, they'll put out a lineup, and based on like the way Benjamin Mora and has this team, the way like the mentality of this group, they feel like they're going to step it up another level for playoffs. So I do wonder about sustainably if they can keep up with Forge in this regular season race, but certainly for the playoffs, as long as, and I think this was the big test, right? Because if they lost this game, Vancouver's within 3 points. All of a sudden, New York's talking about, all right, just holding on to a top 5 spot. And I think now with this win, they should be pretty comfortable in that top 4. Keep that spot, and I think they'll be all right, even if they maybe aren't able to push for a title with that depth.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that with York, like you mentioned, the depth, and I know for me that's also come into play a little bit that I've seen, when they had the little bit of a dip in the last few weeks, it was because of tired legs and kind of the same people having to be played constantly, and it's tough to perform at a high level, especially when you are playing under a new manager and you didn't have a preseason to kind of prepare yourself for what a season under this manager might look like. So I think that might be a concern for me. But yeah, I think in the playoffs, they will definitely be maybe not even a dark horse, maybe a favorite in the playoffs, at least in the style of play that they like to do. They really are good at, as we saw in this match, seeing out games and closing out games. So I'm excited to see how York United do in the playoffs, if and when at this point. Knock on wood, or if they don't get shown up, if they not get knocked out of the playoff spots. Um, if and when they get to the playoffs, I'm excited to see what they look like in those kind of knockout scenarios. But let's move on now to the second game of the weekend, which was the first game on the Saturday. Forge FC against Cavalry FC. Probably the biggest game of the weekend, and I think it lived up to it, both in the action and in the drama. Obviously, there are some comments that we have to address, and we're actually going to listen to, but we'll leave the best for last in this match. We'll talk about some other things before we talk about Tommy Wilden Jr.'s bomba that he dropped in his post-match presser. First, let's talk about the man of the hour in this match and in the league, you could even say, Tristan Borges. I put here a CPL GOAT because honestly, he's become now Forge's top goal scorer. He has been around for 5 out of the 6 years. He was, he went to Leuven in 2020. he's a player that I think really embodies what this league is all about, going from young superstar to this really good seasoned now veteran for Forge. And he, this season is probably for me the greatest season that he's had in his professional career up until this point. I think that the brace that he scored to get today, yes, one was a penalty, but the other one that he had, the little back heel goal, Batty Banga, and just place into the far corner, just kind of really embodies what kind of player Tristan Borges is. He's so important to this Forge side, and even to the CPL. He's a player that you look at the league, at the top players, and you say, yeah, that guy is a staple, and he's the one that kind of, amongst others, carries the kind of brand on their back. What did you make of his performance and the impact that he's had on Forge this season?
Yeah, it feels like he's kind of been Forge's MVP this year, and I think this might be the best version we've seen of Tristan Borges.
Mm.
Genuinely, I think what I've liked is that it's been a slow burn in the sense that it was a hot burn to start. He scored for fun in 2019. It was great to see. Golden Boot, moves to Europe. Great, right? But then he obviously faced some setbacks in terms of COVID and making the jump. He comes back, and it felt like when he came back, it took a while for him to kind of refine himself because he didn't need to be that goal scorer, right? Because Forge had kind of done well to replace pieces around him. They had the Paciuses and whatnot. So Borges was like, all right, let me just kind of be more of a playmaker now. But then, he kind of struggled to score. I remember, I think it was 2022. He had that season. He only really scored against the lower opponents. He was struggling to kind of hit the bigger games for Forge. I feel like this year he's ticked all the boxes. Like, he's got that goal scoring that he had in year one, and he's doing it in big games, right, against the big opponents. But he's still got that playmaking. But then now he's got this defensive side. He's got this drive. Like, it's just incredible to see all that he's bringing to the table for Forge right now. So yeah, this game was great. I mean, that first finish is textbook Borges. How many times have we seen that? Just like, you let him get on that left foot, he can curl it. Carducci, you could almost see it on the face, because it was very similar to 2019 CPL final. Same net too, I think. Carducci was probably thinking like, man, why always him? Just can I get a break from the guy? But yeah, no, I thought for Borges, it was another one of those games where he just took over, and that's what you need from players like that. And in these big games, it's usually it's decided by moments, and who are the best of managing moments. It's your stars, and right now Borges offensively has been the most consistent and the brightest of those lights, and that's on a Forge team where you have Batty Banga, who's a pretty darn good player himself. It's nice to know, because how do you mark that if you're Cavalry, right? You go and try to mark Batty Banga, and he just one touch flicks it for Borges. Like, that goal is just so nice because of everything it represents. So no, shout out to what Tristan Borges is doing right now.
Yeah, what a player. Genuinely one of my favorite players to watch, and has been one of my favorite players to watch. I remember that goal 2019. I was behind that net when that goal went in. And I tried very hard not to celebrate since I might have been on TV.
Bolt. I remember I think I was in the stadium for that one as well. I just remember the way it came off his foot from up in the press box. You could just see, it felt like as soon as he shot it, it was a goal.
Yeah, exactly. As soon as he shot it, you knew exactly where it was going. But yeah, fantastic player and a really good performance. A little harsh on his yellow that he got, with the penalty. But we'll talk about the penalties at the end. But moving on to Cavalry. Cavalry, I think, came into this a little bit of a tweaked formation. Tommy Golden Jr. isn't one that is opposed to switching things around, especially against tough opponents, and especially in the latter parts of the season. We saw a little bit of a shift to kind of like a 3-5-2 at times. I really like that they pushed Fraser Aird further up, and Camden as well. But, Fraser Aird, for me this season, I've talked about it with Mike for a long time. One of my favorite players to watch this season. His delivery is superb, and I love it when he gets forward for Cavalry. So I like that aspect about it. But once it came to kind of generating chances through the middle, they really struggled to break Forge down. And I got to give a lot of credit to Forge's defense, because I thought they held on really strong up until the goal and the penalty. But I was really impressed by the way that they defended. But for Cavalry, it kind of felt like, they were coming into this with such good form, and then this one they just kind of, you're due a miss game every now and then, and it just felt like in this one, more so than anything in the attacking sense, it was just a little bit of a miss, wasn't it?
Yeah, it felt like two things were off watching Cavalry. I think the big one is just you could feel they missed a 9. Like you mentioned there in the notes, no Lowell Wright to start, which was a bit of a surprise. Of course, Warshewski's been dealing with a knock. You felt that like they just didn't have a central presence they could kind of go through and to keep Forge honest. Because one thing I thought Forge did really well was kind of press Cavalry. Because another thing that I wasn't just tactically I was a bit surprised by was Montgomery on the right, because he's a true lefty. And you could tell every time in possession, his natural instinct was to play inside, which is fine. Like there's no problem with that. But for Cavalry, their two biggest threats on offense are both on the right side. It's Aird, it's Moosey. And by having a left footer on the right side, usually we've seen a lot of righties there. It's been Kobza, it's been Klomp, it's been other options. What's nice about that is that they can just open their hips and constantly feed Aird and Moosey. And I think Forge did a smart job of, you're playing the lefty, we're going to take away Aird and Moosey. And it kind of forced Montgomery into the middle, where Forge then set up a lot of traps, right, with their midfield. They went a little beefier in this game, going like Hoyajapur. You got Cisse, Jensen. It was very clogged, very, very mucky, right? So that's something I noticed from Cavalry. I thought the Montgomery plug, I thought that could have been something they could have switched, just because they didn't feed Moosey and Aird enough. You don't have a focal point. The midfield's loaded. You need to get those two isolated, a 1v1 against defenders, and they didn't enough. And I think Forge, credit has to be given for Forge, because Forge kind of took away those options and dared Cavalry to beat them in other ways. And they just weren't able to get that same sort of penetration down the left, because they just, they don't have the same options, especially because Walling, who's been great down the left, was playing down the middle. So for Cavalry, it just felt like a lot of pieces weren't quite in the right places, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and a fantastic shout on the Montgomery thing. I hadn't even thought about that, but you're right. Having a lefty on the right, it's kind of hard to kind of switch play to the right side, and when you have your two most dangerous players, it is a bit of a hamper on the attack. But yeah, without Lowell Wright and without Warshawski, it's really tough. And Ali Musi, a fantastic a player he is, can only do so much. He needs somebody else to kind of be that focal point, to create space for him that he can exploit, and then he can go and dance through 2-3 players and pop a banger from distance, Ali Musi doing Ali Musi things. But he needs somebody to allow him to do that. And it felt like in this game, for him, he wasn't really allowed that. I didn't think, Valing or Camargo really were able to create that space for him. And that's where they was struggling in a bit. But also, yeah, Forge were just really good centrally, like you mentioned. Mucky is a great word. It was very mucky. It was
We
like,
hardly saw Camargo, for example, and he's
yeah.
someone who's typically very good in this game, because they'll find space between the lines. And Forge is like, nope, no Camargo for you.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's just like there was just like sludge in the middle there. You couldn't get the ball through to him and anything down the middle, and a lot of that is on the Forge's midfield. And I want to talk about one particular player of Forge's midfield, and that is Cisse, and Elamon Cisse. We waited a while for him to come back after it was announced that he was coming back to Forge, but I'm so happy to see him, because he is sort of like a breath of fresh air for Forge, because he's a different kind of player to the other central midfielder players that he has when you have Borges there, or Becker, or Jensen. He's someone that I feel like adds a little bit of that tenacity at times, and he's so kind of cavalier when he's going forward and backwards. You saw that there was a couple of chances that he had in the box or in and around the box, and he ran all the way from midfield to kind of overload into the central areas, and he won't be afraid to overload out wide as well. He'll just be happy to have the ball, and he's technically sound as well for a big guy like him to be good on the ball, be able to have little tricks up his sleeve. He's just a really, really solid player for them, and I think that him coming into this kind of form now will be really helpful for Forge going into their favorite time of the year, which is the playoffs.
Yeah, it's funny because I think Forge's midfielders, all of them are so ball dominant. Like Hojabapur, so good in possession. Becker goes without saying. You got Jensen as well, who's shown that, I can switch a ball and fire it too. Whereas Cisse, his best attributes come off the ball. Like, yeah, he's good on the ball. He can't. He's technically able to play the Forge style. He could play 1-2 touch, but that's his best attributes. Like his work rate, his what he brings off the ball for you. He's willing to make unselfish runs. He's willing to do a little dirty work defensive. I think it gives something a bit of a different look to that Forge middle, and I think it was felt in a game like this where Forge, like we mentioned, were mucky, it was defensive, it was grindy. To have someone like that who was willing to put in those extra yards, those extra miles, and he's not going to be a guy who really demands the ball. It really pays off, and I think that's why Forge are going to be so happy to have him in the big games. They kind of saw it, right? I mean, of course, you know how influential he was in that 2019 final, and he's the kind of guy you want in these big games. And I think for Forge, it's quite a luxury that they have him as a depth option. And man, just imagine trying to pick a midfield for playoffs when you got all those names you mentioned. Of course, Achinari Janssen can step into midfield. They've been playing Borges as a 10, which could drop one of these guys out. Like, Smyrniotis is definitely going to have some uncomfortable meetings when it comes to picking his 11 and his subs for some playoff games.
Yeah, and I think Cisse, when you were talking about him, he reminded me of, like, obviously a completely different player, but in the role that he's taken, he gives me a little bit of that N'Golo Kante kind of vibe in the way that he's an engine, he's work rate, off the ball, he's so good, but still he can do a defensive job and he can help out in the attack, kind of in that box-to-box mode. I think he'll be a great player and is a great player to have for Forge going into this, the last part of the season, which people call the pre-playoffs. It's like the playoffs before the playoffs. But for that and also the playoffs, I think he's going to be a really important piece for them. But now let's go into the elephant in the room with this match, which was obviously the post-match with Tommy Williams Jr. and what happened during the match that elicited those post-match reactions, which were the penalty calls and the overall refereeing. We're going to play for you guys now a little bit of the audio visual of the press conference from Tommy Williams Jr. and all that he had to say on what this match turned out to be with the refereeing decisions.
Tom, maybe start with your kind of overall thoughts on that game, because it's kind of a weird one.
Well, it was a terrific game, spoiled by the referee.
Just maybe about the kind of formation shift you guys started with the back three.
Listen, we can talk tactics all day, because every day we'll have good tactics, but you get nothing here. And I'm surprised. I think we both aren't penalties. It changes the absolute outcome of the game. It's poorly managed, and every time you come here, it's no different. Pacific Rio last week had 2 goals that were ruled out. So I just think now, if this is to be a playoff game, I'm tired of coming here and getting on the wrong end of bad decisions, because I feel for our lads, because they perform well, and I think it's just ruined the game.
So that was Tommy Williams Jr. With a bit of inflammatory comments. I felt bad. Was it Charlie who was asking the questions at him? I don't think he was necessarily prepared to be kind of overrun by Tommy Williams Jr., especially when he was trying to kind of deflect it towards the tactics, and Tommy was just like, I don't want to talk about tactics. We can talk about tactics another day. I want to talk about the refereeing decisions. First, let's talk about the comments, and then we can talk about the decisions. But what did you make of Tommy Williams Jr.'s comments, and did you expect that out of him? Because he's usually quite, composed for a manager.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess yes and no, because I want to say there was something similar-ish when it was, I want to say this would have been 2022, perhaps. I think I think it was, because I don't know if you remember, it was Forge Cavalry. I think it was the semifinals, and David Norman Jr. got a red card, and I think, and I want to say after there was something kind of similar where Williams Jr. was just absolutely livid after the game, because there was a lot of controversy about that red card. I don't know if that rings a bell. I want to say it's 22, because that would make sense, because Ottawa Pacific was one semi, Ottawa won, Forge Cavalry was the other, Forge won, and then it went to the final. So yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. So I've seen it before, but yes, I think it's obviously strategic, because it's Cavalry just dropped a couple of points. They dropped points to Valour. They now lost. It feels like that kind of is it for their title push. It seemed like they were going to do it. This is kind of like the light in the fire, right? It's dropping the match of the, well, us against the world. And look, Carlos Gonzalez pulled that card a few weeks ago, and Ottawa has been doing pretty all right since. So I think it's one of those where it's as much tactical, because I mean we can dive into the decisions. I was a bit surprised because I'm watching back, like for the most part the decisions were pretty reasonable on both sides, just like in terms of both sides. And I think it's something where for Tommy Wilden Jr. to go such scorch earth, it seemed a little more deliberate versus like anything with the decisions itself, because ultimately I think Forge were the deserved winners on the day, right? Like it's not something where Cavalry will sit there feel like that cost us the game. So that's kind of why I feel that way.
Yeah, fair. And that is something that, a lot of managers tend to do. I always call that the Jose Mourinho tactic, because I know Mourinho loved doing that tactic in his storied career. But yeah, looking at the actual calls themselves, I feel like the first one, the handball, you have to give it because the hand's not really in a natural position there. I don't see too much issue with that one. I think that was the correct call. I mean, we'll talk about a worse,
Yeah, I
I
was gonna
think,
say I like this
handball call.
a lot more than the one we saw in the Valour Ottawa game, where that one, like, ultimately Camden's arm was like his hand was out. It was just very sloppy from him. So that's when I saw. I was like, you know what,
It
ball.
sucks, but you gotta give it, right?
Yeah, like he
it's
left his hand out there, right? Like we'll go to the Campbell one where Campbell did nearly everything in his power to get his hands out of the way, and it caught his elbow, and then they called it. That one, not the biggest fan of that one, but I thought the Camden one was pretty fair.
Yeah, and then I think the only one that I could see be 50-50. And to be fair to Tommy, he said neither of them were penalties, so it wasn't even like he was being like biased. He said that neither of them were penalties. Was the one on Borges where it felt like I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it was warranting that kind of reaction from Camargo in the box. I didn't think he fully elbowed him. It's kind of like, I always say, I watch a lot of F1 as well. I mean, there's something called like, it's just like, oh, it's a racing incident where like those things just happen in the sport, and you don't really penalize for it. It's just like, it's a contact sport. There's going to be things that occur in the game. That's how I kind of felt like that call was. I think it was a little bit of a soft penalty and a soft yellow for Borges, but ultimately I don't know if the referee felt, well, if I called for that one, I got to call for this one, or if he genuinely felt that was a penalty as much as any other penalties that he wanted to call in the league. But that one was the only one that I was like, I don't know if I would have given it.
Yeah, that one was iffier, because what I'd say about that one is I think I can see why it was called a foul, because Borges did, kind of, he put his body and he, kind of swung his arm a bit, but I thought it was a 50-50, like you mentioned, like to use the racing incident, like 50-50. Like I thought Borges was entitled for his space, as was Camargo, and Borges just ultimately got the better of Camargo in that scenario. So that one, I would agree that it was just like, I was a bit surprised. Like I see, like watching the replay, you see the contact, you see like why it was given, but I felt Borges had done well to defend. But other than that, like, the two calls, again, I don't know how much they really influenced the game where Forge was on the front foot for so much of it.
Yeah, exactly. I think the game kind of had the natural result from how the momentum played out in the match. But for Cavalry, you mentioned there, like their title hopes kind of become extinguished from this. Do you see them being able to recover from this in the last 6 games? Do you think that they will still believe that they can go and win the title, or do you think they'll be focusing on now just securing second place and going as high as they can to kind of face Forge in that semi-final in the playoffs?
Yeah, it's funny because I think a few weeks ago they were probably one of my favorites, if not the favorite for the title. But I think what's happened again over the last few weeks, and I think what's been the story of their season, is they just need to get their guys healthy. They just need they need Eric Kobza for the playoffs. Like they've lost Maël Henry for the playoffs, so they need to make sure Camargo's health, like running for the playoffs. Warshewski, because I think there's no doubt that when this Cavalry team is healthy, they're very good. Even when they're not healthy, they're still very competitive. They're not losing game, like getting blown out. They're drawing games. I think they just need guys healthy. And if that means making some sacrifices that might lower their chances of finishing first, but ensures that maybe, they finish third or fourth, but they're healthy. That's what matters. I think if you're Cavalry, you're confident you can go up against anyone, including Forge, right? They've had some pretty good games against Forge. I just think for them in the title race right now, that's probably their priority, and we'll see how Tommy Wilden Jr. match are prepared. Maybe this will be a good run. Like, for example, give Lowell Wright some runs up front. Like, maybe it might, as he gets up to speed in this system, maybe it's a bit of a slow learning curve, but maybe that pays off in the playoff, knowing that, okay, if Warshewski's not available, you also have the contingency plan, the same way how I said, like, with how good Mile Henry was, it felt like he was a nailed-in starter for the playoffs. And now that he's gone, all right, get that 2022, 2023 Camargo back in to that level we know he can be at, but through injuries and rhythm that we haven't necessarily seen yet.
Yeah. And I think that'll be crucial, not just for Camargo, but for everybody, like you mentioned, to stay fit in these last, 6 games. Half of them are at home, which is good for Cavalry. And the great thing is that the last 4 games that they have are all against the bottom 4. So arguably would be points where you expect them to take, maximum points, or at least a majority of them. So there is still that hope for them to finish really strong. And I'm sure that if they can't get first, they want minimum to get second, so they can get that revenge against Forge for last year's sort of like semifinal, who will host the final kind of thing. But yeah, it really will depend on who's available, because Mile Henry is a huge miss. I was so sad for them when he had that season-ending injury, and not having Warchowski, not having that focal point there. That's why you gotta, like you mentioned, give a chance to Lowell Wright, because you need that. You saw in this game that you kind of can't play a kind of winger up at striker or have a false 9. It doesn't really work against the top teams like Forge. I don't think it would work against Ottawa, teams that know how to defend and clog up the middle. York, that would be a nightmare to play against York, and not be able to have that. So.
And I'll continue to bang the Cobbs the drum as well, just because of what he brings in possession. They really miss that when he's not healthy.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of examples of players that they need to bring back if they want to do this one last push for the title and for second place. And we'll see how they do that in the weeks to come. But let's move on to the third game, which was Pacific against Halifax. You were on this not for CPL, but for OneSoccer. You were doing double duty, watching the Whitecaps game while watching this one. And we joked at the Vancouver FC game that one of those 2 games is going to be likely a dud. That we didn't expect the Pacific FC game to be the one that was all action, but it did end up being all action, because Pacific scored not 1, not 2, but 3 goals in a match for the first time, I think, since the away win against Valour like a few months ago. And it was a dream for the home side, beating Halifax 3-0. I mean, I couldn't believe that they scored goals. And I remember you looking over at Sam, who was beside you, and at me, just like throughout the game, just couldn't believe what was happening. Both Pacific scoring and, as we'll talk about in a little bit, Halifax self-destructing. But let's first talk about Pacific. And I can't believe it. They're scoring again, 3 goals. I put here, am I dreaming? Because it feels like it. It felt like it, because it feels like it's been so long since we've seen Pacific be clinical in the attack. What did you sort of make out of the performances of the attackers, like, Zanata and, even Andre Tirkoveanu and Moses Dyer and all the goal scorers and the attackers?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe I guess this is an extreme take, but let's go there. If you're Pacific, do what you can to re-sign Moses Dyer. I think that's the big take, is that Moses Dyer is exactly everything they've missed, and arguably everything they've missed even since like Alejandro Diaz left. And I think it's not even just the output, because of course Diaz's output was ridiculous. Dyer has been nowhere close to that. And I mean, Diaz was historic, 13 goals in 18 games. I don't think we've ever seen anyone get close to that, and we may not for a while. But even Dyer doesn't have to do that. But what I noticed with Dyer, it's a lot of what Diaz did so well for Pacific. it's off the ball runs, it's movement, it's pressing, it's just the whole package. And I think it's really telling that James Merriman sat there with us, or at least I'm not sure if you were there that game, the Pacific one in Vancouver, where he went on that rant that was kind of like, we need more, in our attack, we need to be willing to make the sacrifices, we need to want it. And I think Dyer's been exactly what the team was missing, because you watch him in this game, and this is what's astounded me about Dyer this season in particular. His best games, like, he can really take over with his work rate, with his desire, with his like, and you don't see that often for strikers, right? Because the best strikers, they take over games when they're scoring. And for Dyer, he has this ability to just be such a presence, and it was felt. Like, for example, the first goal, right? Great sequence where Zanata gets the ball, he whips it in, falls to Turkovanu. Great. If you have a chance to watch it again, watch Dyer. Watch the way he makes this sacrificial run across the near post. There's no chance of getting the ball, but he drags a defender with them. Boom, it opens up a space where Turkovanu can be in. Goal. And there's several runs Dyer made like that throughout the game. And the reality is for Pacific, and that I think that's kind of what Merriman was saying in that rant, is that he hasn't seen that enough of, all right, guys are just kind of making runs if it means they're getting the ball, but guys aren't making runs to stretch the back line. They're not making runs to pull guys out of position, because it's just, and that's been a huge issue. And I think Dyer has come in and he opened up space for Turkovanu, Zanata, Reed, and it's not a coincidence that all those guys were able to shine. So I'd really chalk up to what Dyer did up front to what this means, because Pacific has pieces. I will continue to say they got pieces. I think Hurd, when healthy, Reed, like Turkovinu, he's had a few games now where it's like, man, you're just left wanting more. But I think they've kind of lacked something to tie it all together. And I do wonder if Dyer's just overall work rate, overall presence might be that missing piece.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that Moses Dyer, that was exactly what I was thinking too. Moses Dyer is being what they've been lacking at a striker position since Alejandro Diaz left them in 2022. You've seen that they've tried to replace him with other strikers. We saw Ongaro last season. You saw Rion Moore this season. Haven't really been able to have that impact. And it comes down to like what you mentioned. I especially, we got to see him with Vancouver FC for most of the season, and we got to see him live and see what he's able to do. And the biggest thing for me is that he's just feisty when he plays. Like, he will barrel down to chase a ball, and he will push anybody in his way to get there. He will never say die for a ball until it's out of bounds, essentially. And I don't know if it's the Kiwi in him, but it just feels like he has a bite to him that was lacking from pretty much most players of Pacific. It's just that ability to hound defenders, eat up that space, create that space for others, like you mentioned in the first goal. I think that, when I originally saw the trade, I think most people originally saw the trade, I think they said that actually is a really good trade for both teams, because, we talked about Saluf, what he's capable of doing for Vancouver, and being that option for a plan B if they can utilize it properly. And for Moses Dyer, he's that focal point for Pacific. He's that player that they can finally, play off of, and he can be that hold up player. He can create that space. He can be that fox in the box. He can score goals as well, as we saw with the third one. It's not like he's just a workhorse. He is a goal scorer as well. So he kind of does everything for them. And we saw glimpses of that even before, when Pacific were, in the last two games when Dyer was there, he wasn't able to do as much, but we still saw those glimpses that he's becoming more of an integral piece for them. And now this one really kind of showed how much he's fully blossomed as the main man for Pacific. And so it was fantastic to see. And I also gotta give it to also like Zanata. I thought Zanata played very well. I think this was his most confident game that I've seen him play. The way that he just was so direct off the left, cutting inside, taking on his man. He played with an intensity and with a hunger that was lacking pretty much all season. I don't know. He mentioned that he had friends and families in the stands, and maybe that kind of gave him a little bit of the extra motivation. But I think that was the best game that he played for Pacific, and I'm really happy that he got the penalty goal to kind of reward him for the performance. But Pacific, yeah, fantastic overall for them, and they were helped a little bit though from ill discipline. I'll say that much to put it nicely. Some ill discipline from their opposition in Halifax, because Halifax ended the match with 9 men, 2 red cards, both second yellows. The second one way worse than the first, but the first one still obviously needless. I don't even know where to begin with this one. Honestly, I guess we'll start with Nimick. You know, you see the way that he got that first yellow card, and then you know you're on the yellow card, and then you go and you basically hook Moses Dyer by the neck. And if it was any other player, I think the player would have been thrown down, because Moses Dyer is, like I mentioned, feisty. He's not going to back down. He's going to keep going. It was evidently a second yellow. I don't know if you agree, but for me, it was like, oh yeah, that's absolutely a yellow card. It doesn't matter if you had a first yellow card. You shouldn't put yourself in positions to get a second yellow card. That's a yellow card, and a needless one, because you had other players around you that could still defend if he got through.
Oh, it was 1,000% a yellow, because I remember I saw the play and I didn't realize it was Nimick who had just gotten a yellow, and I was like laughing like, that's a yellow. And then I just got Adam Jenkins in my ear on the broadcast being like, and that's Nimick who is on a yellow. Oh, it was Nimick. Yeah, he's cooked. Like, that's a second yellow. Like, it just felt like it was one where it had to be given. Yeah, there was some arguments of Moses Dyer was kind of also given it, and I think Moses Dyer left a little in after. Yeah, Dyer maybe could have got a yellow for that. Fair, but I think ultimately it was always a yellow for Nimick. Like, especially when Dyer was gone and the ball was with him. Like, either you make the sacrifice of pulling him back, as Nimick did, and you get your yellow, or you take the risk. He went for the second yellow, and yeah, I think it's one where I think if you're Halifax, it kind of sums up the season. And man, I think the stat that's wild. It was like six red cards, 5 wins on the season. Like, those are just not the kind of stats you want to be seeing from the Wanderers. But yeah, to start with the Nimick one, because we'll get into this Lockery one. I thought the Nimick one was just a bit of a no-brainer. Not like outrageous from Nimick, but it was just like poor timing of decision. Like, especially at that point of the game, halftime's about to come around. And you had defenders with you too. Like, it's not like you're the last man. Maybe I would have changed my mind if he's the last man. You take that risk of a surefire goal. They had guys around him too, right? Like, they had other center backs there, and that's where you're kind of like, it wasn't even really necessary either.
Yeah, no, and that's the thing. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't. It was a needless challenge, and yeah, I think it kind of embodies how Halifax have been. Where it just feels like Halifax have been their own worst enemy for most of this season. It's just been themselves screwing themselves, and this was just another, more sharp and acute example of that with both red cards. And we'll move
most
on
of
now.
the red cards, like, what, 3 of them have been for dissent.
Yeah.
One of them is you took off a shirt and then you time wasted. Like, that's the thing. It's one thing to have reds. Reds happen in a season. Like the Cavalry one, you know what? It happens. He made a mistake. His leg was caught. He put his leg up. He caught Manny Aparicio. It was a red card. Fine. That happens. That was like game number 3 for them. That was their home opener. Fine. For Gangue-Ruzic, to have the one against Forge with the dissent, for Lockery to dissent, this Nimick one where you say it's kind of a bit unnecessary, the Coimbra one, that's where you're looking at the Wanderers. Like again, if reds happen, you can earn your reds. To have silly reds, oof.
That's the worst. And I think that for us, though, that we're being around the game as well, we understand that Reds also have like a psychological impact too, because you put your team down, you're a man down, it becomes even harder to try to go again, especially when you're a goal down. And then as they accumulate, it becomes more of an issue. I mean, Halifax have been doing their best kind of, York under Martin Nash last season impression with these red cards and these, yellow cards for dissent and for arguing and for time wasting. And it's so unlike them, at least from what we saw from last season, and especially the Kale Lockery one, because I I struggle to be able to have any sympathy for him because you don't need to be a lip reader to know exactly what he said. And I love that the camera panned right in on him when when that happened afterwards, because it was a bonehead move from him, and it's a big lesson from him, and he's a good defender. He just lost the plot in that moment, and to get two quick fire yellows, you just can't do that. And it's ridiculous, especially since the ref gave him some grace. It wasn't like on the first yell that he gave him the second yell. He
It
waited
was like
until I
yellow
think it was,
3.
yeah,
It was like the third.
it was three like expletives that he's like, all right, three strikes and you're out, and then he was out. But just it's just ridiculous, Alex, the way that he got sent off.
Yeah, that one for me is like, I'd say is quite unacceptable. Like the Nimick one, again, lack of judgment, careless, sloppy, malicious. No, right? It was just a mistake timing wise. The Lockery one is just, it's so unnecessary, especially too. It's contextually like if you're gonna have any chance of getting points out of the game, 10 was gonna help us sure a lot more than 9. You see it with 10. 10's possible. 9, that's kind of where you draw the line. And you're already out. Nimick's already out for your next game. Suspension, Forge. You're already short some defenders. You go get suspended for that game too. Like it's just like the context of that, and especially dissent. I think for Halifax, I think like you mentioned, it's been such a surprise, but it's also like it's frustrating because for Halifax, clearly it just hasn't been their season in some regards. Like luck has not been with them. No doubt. Like their XG numbers have been good. Their offensive numbers have been good, and they've not been finishing to that rate. They can look and feel like we've been unlucky. Ditto on like their overall play. But what happens when you deal with bad luck? You control what you can control. And I think, going after referees, getting cards for dissent, that's just like, simply put, like the thing you can control the least, right? Like you can control little things about, how you talk to people, those dissent cards, etc. And I think for Halifax, it's frustrating because there's a good team in there, but right now it feels like their energy's channeled towards the wrong thing, so to speak, right? And I think in this Pacific game, you could feel it. Like it felt like for most of the game they were boiling over, and it was just not being channeled into the field. Whereas Pacific, you could feel that frustration. That frustration's been there. But they were like, all right, we're just going to put it in our play. We're going to put an honest effort and see where it brings us. And I think Halifax kind of lost that battle with themselves. And the locker one's a perfect example. Like, fine, you can argue if the first card or the first tackle is even a yellow. Fine. You take the yellow, you just turn around, you run back to position. Simple. You don't have all this problem. And for Halifax, I think you're looking at that one where now it's been a few of those that have piled up, and you kind of wonder of why is that energy not being maybe put towards what they can control.
Yeah. And it's about, as like you say, it's about channeling it, right? You're allowed to be frustrated. You can be frustrated at a situation. You can be frustrated at your bad luck, but you got to channel it. And at some point, you got to create your own luck. And I think that for Halifax, they have the tools to be able to create their own luck. And they've shown that, they had a good run of form before this as well, where it looked like they were starting to pick up speed and stuff like that, going back to the basics. But it's just moments like these that can be, especially when you compound them, season defining. And I think that's something that Patrice guys will be disappointed in, and the players will be disappointed. And obviously the fans are going to be disappointed because they know everyone will that they can do better, and they should do better. And it's put them in a really, really tough position for the game against Forge, because now they don't have a Dan Nimick. They don't have a Kale Lockery. Gagnon Lapare is going to be missing due to yellow card accumulation. They already are having other injury issues. They're probably going to have to rely on their young players. Again, they had to a little bit in this game because of the sending offs, and also because I think they only have like 1,200 under 21 minutes right now with 6 games to go. So they kind of have to put some young players. I mean, it's not looking like they'll make the playoffs anyways, but if they do, then they want to make sure that they don't put this late push for nothing. So they have to play the under 21s. But do you see them having hope against Forge in the run that Forge have without these crucial players, and having to rely on some of the younger players that kind of step up so late in the season?
I mean, it's going to be tough, no doubt, based on the form Forge is in. But I guess on one hand, you can say maybe this is what they need, because that's the last point on what we said before. That's been the biggest surprise about like the discipline and how the Wanderers have been, that it's coming from their experienced players. It's coming from players who've been solid in this league before, or in the case of some others, like players who had been there last year on that good Wanderers team would learn some lessons. Like, it'd be one thing if this was a young, inexperienced Wanderers team. That happens. Football learning lessons moved on, right? Like, the fact that it's a pretty experienced team. This is a team that beefed up on adding experience to a young group, because last year they were one of the youngest groups. Like, and it shows in the fact, like the U21 minutes, right? Like, it's one thing if they were racking up U21 minutes and learning these lessons, you could be like, all right, well, they're young, they're under 21 guys, they're going to learn. So maybe this is a bit of a blessing, because some of those U21 guys have shown good things. Like, I thought Rushanas in goal, like, I thought he was a bright light in this game. He had good mentality, made some good saves, kept his head up even as his team fell down to 9. He made some huge save, I think, to keep the game 3-0, which, hey, it might not seem much, but goal difference matters. To see that pride from your goalkeeper matters. Who knows? Maybe this U21 thing can be a bit of a blessing for Halifax. So they can look at these guys, because some of them have been bright off the bench slightly or in starts, like Jefferson Alphonse. I've liked what he's brought since he's been signed. Camilo Vasconcelos has had some nice cameos off the bench. Coimbra is going to work hard and, bring that honest effort leading the line. Maybe you just throw some of those guys in and maybe they surprise you. And I guess that's the thing for Halifax. Maybe this opportunity that's been, created by some of the more experienced players opens the door for some of those youngsters to say, hey, maybe you should have been looking at me more this year.
Yeah. And I guess in a sense, it's kind of the situation where it's like, well, we've dug ourselves this massive hole. It's on you guys now to get us out of it. And it's a lot of pressure, I think, on the young players. But you mentioned, I think some of them have shown some really good things this season. And now it's about, whether you're ready for it or not, you're going to be called upon, because experienced players have made mistakes, and it's up to you to kind of try to, make up for it. And I think for Halifax, it's going to be really telling to see what the team as a whole is made of in not only the next match against Forge, but in the next few matches as they close out the season. Because at the very least, even if they don't make playoffs, they want to finish as strong as possible and kind of just get this year behind them, kind of, regroup, do a little bit of soul searching, and then get to, building off what they did in the first season next season. But now let's move on to the fourth and final game of the match day, which was Valour against Ottawa, a 1-1 draw. In this one, it was the only draw of the match day, which is nice. We got a lot of winners, a lot of losers. And this one, you could say that maybe we should have gotten a winner, especially on the way that the game started, because for Valour, Mike's not here to sing praises, to wax lyrical about Valour as the resident Valour fan, so we'll have to make up for it. But Valour started the game in a really, really good way. I thought it was a brilliant start by the home side. I think they had a really great energy when they came to it. They really brought it to Ottawa. I think Ottawa were slow out of the gate, and Valour knew that. And for the first 15, 20 minutes, Valour were just all over them. I swear they had something like 60-something or 70-something% possession in those first 15, 20 minutes, which against Ottawa this year is something that you don't really see all that often. And it was just amazing to watch. And I look at what Phil Dos Santos has been able to do with this team. As Mike put it at the beginning of the season, he had a band of misfits to start the season and had to play the first quarter and a bit of the season exclusively away. And look how far he's been able to turn this side around and make them potentially a playoff team. It was just super impressive. And yeah, I thought that the way that Valour began this game really showcased how far they've come.
Yeah, it feels like Valour has an identity. Like, you can feel that identity, and I think it's telling in little things. Whereas, all right, Fracinieri's out. He's been super great lately. His progression has been fantastic. Well, Dante Campbell slots right back into the center back, no problem. And that's always a tale of, a team that's got an identity, whereas it's so clear what you and your teammates are supposed to do. You can fill in for them because you know what is required of you, what is asked of you. I think it's, Phil DeSantis has clearly found his group that's worked the best. Is 4-2-2, Swivel and Hundle leading the line. Hundle finding a bit of form. Swivel as well has been popping up with goals. Like, I just look across that board and I see a team that knows what they want to do. They know how to do it, and you see it in games when everything's clicking. It's there. So yeah, for Valour, this is a bit of an unlucky one. Not to get more out of. Definitely, I think one area where maybe that's perhaps just, they've got that identity, but that difference that's maybe kept them where they are in the table is that they could have put this game away. I think of that Swivel breakaway chance when it's 1-0. Just, you get something there. Maybe that's something 2-0 lead. I struggle to see Valour giving that up with how solid they were defensively. But overall, like, they're showing they're going toe-to-toe with these games, playing their style. They've got what it takes to at least make some noise in this playoff race. But I think that's kind of been the big thing. Like, where you look across recent results, for as good as they've played, you do wonder in terms of just being able to close out those games, to put those games away. But despite that, lots to like.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. It's just they're lacking a little bit maybe of experience. They're lacking maybe a little bit of those kind of difference makers in the team that can help both offensively and offensively close those games out. Like you mentioned, that breakaway, that could have definitely been the turning point overall. But there's still a lot of good things. I think Temi Antonoglu, I think, is easily, maybe Swivel has a case, but I think Temi Antonoglu is easily the player of the season for Valour. It just makes such a difference when he's on the pitch, and you felt that in those first 15, 20 minutes, the way that he, set up for Hundle's opener, and the way that he just has been electric, and the creative focus for Valour on that left-hand side. When he doesn't play, you see Valour really struggle to create goals, but when he is there, he's one of the, the best assisters in the league. And for such a young player, he's really kind of showing that Valour tend to really have, good young left backs that they can call upon. Last season was Matteo De Brienne. This season, a different kind of player in Temi Antonoglu, but still, a really, really talented player. And I'd love to see him play for Valour. And Hundal, like you mentioned, getting a little bit of form, starting to score some goals, starting to get some assists, coming at a good period, at the end of the season. But yeah, just lacking a little bit to be able to close out these games and to be able to see the fruits of their own, of their own efforts. It's there, they do good work, but it's just sometimes they switch off. But yeah, in the game against Cavalry, the game against Ottawa, they've shown, and obviously the game against Forge, they've shown that they can go toe to toe with these, with the big teams, and they can cause them problems and even come up on the winning side. So it's about them moving and reaching that next level, and if they can steal that playoff spot off Vancouver FC, I think it'll be something that I don't know if you can say it's undeserved. I think for what they've been able to come back from, especially with the start that they had, where I'll be honest, me and Mike both had no hopes for them in this season. It's just a testament to everything they've been able to do. But moving on to Ottawa, it's been a weird time for Ottawa lately. It's been very up and down for them. And I was looking at their waveform. They still have the best waveform of the league right now. But as of lately, I think since June, they've only beaten the two BC sides. Aside from that, they've either drawn or lost all of the rest of their away games. And it's concerning as somebody that, as a team that's supposed to be the title contenders, for them to kind of just, when they're away from home, lack that bite to the way that they attacked, lack that just intensity that we saw from them at the beginning of the season. What do you think that kind of comes down to, or what are your thoughts on their struggles that they have had lately?
Yeah, it's a good question, that in terms of that, just what's not clicked for them. I think, I don't know. It feels like for Ottawa, maybe they've just needed a bit of a shock factor in terms of, everything, in the sense that they had such a hot start. Everything was clicking, that maybe you get a bit comfortable, a bit complacent, right? That's often sometimes the challenge, especially when they're heavy favorites. A lot of, people are looking like, all right, like this team should be contending for a treble. And I do wonder for them, that's kind of been the big battle, is complacency of they were a top team and then they kind of slipped up, and then they've kind of recovered a bit and put themselves back in that title race after it looked like they slip out. Perhaps maybe that's it with the away form. Maybe they'd kind of scratched a bit of they'd earned a bit of a reputation as one of the stronger road teams, and maybe they're kind of thinking like, oh yeah, we can waltz into a Winnipeg and get a 3 points because we've had good results against Valour, and Valor's like, no, like this isn't an easy place to waltz into. Because yeah, that's the thing with Ottawa. You watch them in games, it's like it's hard to put your finger on it, right? Because you see flashes, you see they've got the pieces, but it hasn't always necessarily clicked over the last few months, other than maybe that Pacific game where they did quite well. And some other examples of it. So I feel like that's going to be their big challenge heading in the playoffs. Can they find that spark? Can they find that? Because we've seen it. Like they've shown it against Forges. They've shown it against Yorks, Cavalrys. When they're on, it's hard for any team in this league to beat them. But for whatever reason, it's like you mentioned, they just kind of lack that it factor. And perhaps maybe it's just been a bit of complacency that can sometimes come with being the favorite. So I think it can be hard to be a top team because you have to be good from week 1 to week 28. You can't afford any slip-ups.
Exactly. And I think the word that I wrote down in my notes, and I think really encompasses it, is just that Ottawa have become stagnant lately. It just feels like they're kind of slowing down at the worst time, which is at the end of the season. And the way they started, they were clear title favorites with a healthy gap over second place, and now they've fallen back down and are having to deal with York and Cavalry and Forge in this title race. It's been amazing for us and for the neutrals, because this is the tightest table we've seen, I think, in history from the CPL. But I think for them, they'll be sorely disappointed, and questions will probably be asked about, Carlos Gonzalez, because he hasn't had the best of records lately in terms of closing out seasons. We know what happened last season, and in especially in added time. So I think that it's going to be a little bit of a concern for Ottawa and its fans, to kind of see this slowing down at the end of the season. Again, because in this match, I looked at the stats, 0.62 XG from 9 shots, and the only shot on target was the penalty. That's just not good enough, just plain and simple, against a team that, yes, Valour are a good team now and they're getting into form, but they're still a bottom 4 team. These are not the teams that you're supposed to be, quote unquote, struggling against, but they are. And it doesn't matter if it's away from home or at home. Like you mentioned, when you're a top dog, you got to be good everywhere. You got to be good all the time. You have to be the favorites. And maybe it's because of how much star power that they have, like you mentioned, complacency is coming in, or maybe it's something even deeper that we might have to kind of diagnose after the season's done. But for now, until the end of the season, yeah, it feels like Ottawa are needing somebody to kind of step up. And it's weird to say that somebody needs to become the hero when they have a star-studded team. You'd think that somebody would be the player to step up, but maybe it's exactly that. Maybe the issue is not about the players individually. Maybe it's just about the team itself kind of being a cohesive unit and lacking that a little bit lately.
Yeah, it's about habits. Because one thing I will say, I did have concerns about their start. And what I just say is that even when they were winning, like there were some games, I think like it started week 1 when they beat York at home 2-1, came back from behind 2-1 or 1-0 to win 2-1. Wasn't a great game from Ottawa, but it was 2 moments of brilliance. They win, boom. And it was encouraging because those are the games that win you titles, right? You need to win games where you weren't playing well, but it was a bit worrying for Ottawa that there were a bunch of wins where it just kind of felt like they slumbered through and they won. And I'd say that just sticks out because I remember asking Carlos Gonzalez about that specifically. Like, are you kind of worried about habits, complacency? And he was like, yeah, 100%. It is a huge worry because you want to ultimately, if you want to win titles, you have to be 110% every week. So I think for what it's worth, this has been a battle they've been facing since week 1. And I think that's what's so unique about it is that I think genuinely across from week 1 to where we are week 22, their overall form maybe hasn't changed all that's like much, but it's just for them, it's maybe that complacency really hit them in the middle of it. And I think habits is probably a big one. And I think, to be fair to Carlos Gonzalez, I think he knows that. He's continued to stress. If you ask him, like, he's like, yeah, I want us to, have good habits to focus on that. But for Ottawa, that's kind of been a bit of a big challenge. But on one hand, I get it. Part of the reason of all this, or part of the thing of all this pressure that has been put on them by media, by fans, is that ultimately this is a team that wants to contend for trophies. And it can be hard to think about a week 5 game, a week 10 game, a week 15 game when your goal is to be lifting silverware at the end of the year. And I do wonder if over these last 4 or 5 games and into the playoffs, maybe we'll see them kind of sit up, lock in, right? Like, this is what they've been working for all year long. Well, if that's kind of been this moment, I do wonder if we see them finally turn it up in that regard, just because when there is a title focus, that's the tough thing champions don't realize. Yes, champions are crowned in week 28, but week 5, week 10 is important. But maybe for Ottawa, they've kind of felt like it hasn't been. And now that's why I'm curious if we see a bit of a response in that regard in these last few weeks.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that maybe it's just the overall approach from this season. And that's what I mentioned. Like, maybe that's something that after you and I and other people, the CPL sickos, will look to break down and diagnose in the postseason. But it's something that, Carlos Gonzalez doesn't have that luxury. He has to figure it out now, and he has to deal with it now if he wants any chance to be able to get back into that title fight and to be able, they're only 4 points behind Forge, but if they don't have that kind of danger again in the attack, then it's not. They might tumble down as York and Cavalry are going to keep searching. So we'll see what happens with them. Before we close out the show, we will play the game once more of Was That a Penalty? Part 3. I know you've said your piece on the Campbell penalty, so I'll quickly mention mine. I completely agree with you. I don't know what else Campbell could have done. He had his arms crossed behind his back. I guess you could say he was making himself a little bigger because his elbow was sticking out, but like you can't just completely have a 100% of your arms on your body, especially when you're sliding like that. Like, I feel like it was so harsh that as a referee, I know he gave it a second before he blew it, but I feel like that's one where at the very least you kind of call it, like you call maybe you call the penalty, you go talk to your assistant, or maybe you don't call the penalty, but you stop the play and you go talk to your assistant, something where it's like, that one is so harsh that I just feel like Valour kind of get hard done by in that one. And I don't know if I don't know how much it will impact, the title race necessarily, but it could definitely impact the final playoff race. And that's the one that I think will really sting for Phil Dos Santos. Credit to him. He didn't have the Tommy Wilden Jr. blow up afterwards on it. And you would say he had more reason to. But yeah, tough break for them. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like nowadays, especially in the CPL, I don't know what the handball rule is anymore.
Well, that's it. I think this was one of those, now that I think about it, where how the law was written was taken very literally, in the sense that, like, did he make him unnecessarily or unnaturally bigger? Technically, yes, because as a defender, it isn't, or as a player, it's not natural to put your hands behind your back. And if, the chicken wing happens, I guess technically that is the case. But also, I think on the flip side, I think of the rule unintentionally as well. Like, Campbell wasn't trying to throw his hand out or put his hand up to make himself bigger, right? Like, he was trying to get it out of the way. And I feel like that's where it's like, it's harsh to punish him for trying to do the right thing, maybe even if the law doesn't agree about it. And I think that's sometimes where the toughest thing to reckon with the handball, and that's kind of been the split over the last few years and why they keep changing the rules so much. It's hard to find that line between, like, what is natural, what isn't, what is intentional, what isn't. And it's kind of led to this gray zone where ultimately a ball hits the hand and it feels like it's just depends on the day, depends on the moment, depends on the occasion. That ends up being the card. But I think that's something with that I just felt like for Campbell, he did his part to make himself look smaller, to keep his hands out of the way, and for him to still get the penalty call. It just didn't feel right. It just did not feel right whatsoever. But again, alas, welcome to handballs in 2024 and what they can lead to.
Yeah, and great points on handballs. You'd be great on like a sports, like a soccer philosophical kind of like meta discussion podcast. I think that'd be a great subject about intention versus, I guess you could say it's intention versus the actual reality of handballs and what that might look like. But we don't have time for that today.
Ethos versus Pagos versus Lagos.
Exactly. Just
right
go
into the
hella
philosophy.
deep into it. I'd love it. It'd make my masters useful for once. But yeah, that's it. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast episode. Thank you so much to Alex for coming on and deputizing in the wake of Mike Rice's absence. Go ahead and let the people know where they can find you and the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, just pleasure as always to hop on with you, Felipe, and chat. It was good, and always a pleasure. You can find me on Twitter, Alex Gangue-Ruzic. You can find me on Blue Sky as well, and on Threads, Instagram at AGR on the case. And yeah, other than that, it was great to be on.
Yeah, and of course, we follow all the work that he does for OneSoccer and the CPL. He does do work tirelessly for both, as I could get to see at games and even out of games. But make sure to follow us as well on our socials.
Fucking cosign.
Yeah, exactly. At Coast to Coast FC, so that you can give us your thoughts on each of the week's episodes and what you give us comments on what you thought of this week's episode and Alex's return to the Coast podcast. But until next time, I'm Felipe Vallejo.
I'm Alex Gangue-Ruzic.
And this has been Coast to Coast FC, signing out.